At the hospital, my doctor asked, "Do you believe in an afterlife?" I was lying on the examination table with heart pains when the doctor asked that question. My heart was already at 160 beats per minute, and the nurse had just said if it went any higher, I'd be in serious danger. Even stranger, this doctor looked way too young to have completed medical school, and he kept looking around like he was keeping an eye out for something. "We found concerning proxies in your initial tests," he said, going completely against what the nurse told me. "I need to take a blood sample immediately to determine the best treatment to save your life." He pulled out a needle kit from the cabinet. My mind was racing. I'd come in because of heart pains that started during my morning run. Now this doctor was telling me I was dying. He didn't even explain what he'd found or why it was so urgent. Just rolled up my sleeve and without asking for my consent started prepping my arm. My sister was in medical school, so I knew that the needle he pulled out was way bigger than normal blood draw needles. Before I could even ask if this was necessary, he jabbed it into my arm. The pain was instant, and I felt like Coyote Peterson getting stung by the bullet ant. I remember yelling out, especially because he didn't just draw my blood. He kept just digging around in my arm like he was looking for something. I remember feeling my heart rate spiking to near 200, and I tried grabbing his arm to tell him, "Keep quiet and shut up." He yanked away from me. His bedside manner went from nervous to aggressive real fast. That's when I noticed his pants. Green denim jeans. Not scrubs like every other medical professional in this hospital. His white coat looked too big for him, and now that I was really looking, I couldn't see an ID badge anywhere. The pain in my arm was getting worse as he started drawing blood. Way more than a normal sample. "Who are you? You're not wearing scrubs." I tried to pull my arm away, but he held it firm. His eyes went wide when he realized I'd caught on. He yanked the needle out carelessly, making me yelp again. Blood dripped down my arm as he grabbed his supplies and bolted for the door. No explanation. No bandaging my arm. Just ran like his life depended on it. I sat there stunned for about 2 seconds before my brain kicked in. I pressed the call button repeatedly while using my shirt to stop the bleeding. A real nurse rushed in and gasped when she saw the blood. She was helping me when we heard shouting in the hallway. Police officers stormed past my room, 3 of them with hands on their weapons. One stopped and looked at me and the nurse. His face was serious as he took in the blood on my arm. Where did the man go? The one who was just in here? The officer was already on his radio calling in our location. I pointed down the hall where the fake doctor had run. He went that way, took a blood sample and ran when I noticed his clothes. The officer's face went pale. "Please tell me you're joking." That man's wanted for selling organs and patient information for the black market. My stomach dropped and I felt cold all over. The huge needle suddenly made sense. That wasn't for blood. The officer grabbed his radio and started barking orders about sealing exits. Rosie pressed gauze hard against my arm while blood soaked through. My whole body was shaking now. I couldn't stop thinking about what that fake doctor wanted from me. The officer introduced himself as Hugh Davenport while calling for backup. More cops rushed in within minutes. 2 of them started asking me questions while Rosie took pictures of my arm with her phone. I told them everything about the green jeans and the white coat that was too big. I described how nervous he got when I started asking questions. I explained about the huge needle and how he dug around in my arm. One officer wrote everything down while the other one recorded me on his phone. My heart monitor started beeping faster and a new doctor rushed in. She looked at the numbers and her face got serious. She was the cardiologist and she immediately gave me medication through my IV. She explained that my heart rate was still way too high and the stress could cause real damage. She hooked me up to more monitors and told Rosie to stay with me. Hugh left to check something and came back with a security guard and a tablet. They showed me footage of a man entering through the staff door 40 minutes before I saw him. He used some kind of card to get through, but you could see him avoiding the main desk. The security guard admitted the card reader had been broken for weeks. They'd been using manual sign-ins that anyone could fake. My hands were still shaking when I called my sister Janelle. She answered on the second ring and I told her what happened. When I described the needle, she gasped and said that sounded like something for bone marrow, not blood. She said she was leaving right now to drive up and be with me. Hugh came back after talking to other officers and sat down next to my bed. He told me the man's name was Blake Odom, and he'd been doing this for months. He targeted people who came to hospitals alone with serious problems. He figured we'd be too sick or scared to fight back. Blake had hit hospitals in 3 different states already. They'd been tracking him, but he kept slipping away. Hugh said I was lucky I noticed his clothes when I did. Most victims didn't realize until it was too late. Rosie's shift ended at 7, but she stayed with me anyway. She kept apologizing and saying the hospital should have protected me better. She told me the staff had been complaining about security problems for months. The administration kept saying they'd fix things, but never did. They were more worried about saving money than keeping patients safe. Around 9 o'clock, a woman in a suit showed up with a folder. She introduced herself as Catherine McBarnes from Risk Management. She said the hospital would cover all my medical costs from today. She also offered to pay for any follow-up care I needed. I told her I wanted everything she promised in writing. I also wanted to know exactly what security changes they were making. She said they'd install new badge readers and hire more guards. I told her that should have happened before someone tried to steal my organs. She didn't have a good answer for that. Hugh came back with consent forms for my medical records. The police needed them for evidence against Blake. They also wanted the security footage of me from today. I agreed, but told them I wanted copies of everything they took. I was learning fast that I needed to protect myself. Hugh promised to send me everything once they processed it. My arm was throbbing and my heart was still racing even with the medication. The cardiologist came back to check on me and said I'd need to stay overnight. She wanted to monitor my heart and make sure the stress didn't cause lasting damage. Rosie helped me into a hospital gown while being careful of my bandaged arm. The puncture was deep and would probably leave a scar. Every time I looked at it, I thought about what Blake really wanted. I kept thinking about other patients who might not have been as lucky as me. Hugh said they were checking every hospital in the area for similar cases. He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. He also said they'd have an officer outside my room all night just in case. That didn't exactly make me feel safer. It just reminded me that Blake was still out there somewhere. Catherine came back with the papers she promised, and I read every word before signing. The hospital was basically admitting they screwed up without actually saying those words. They were covering their butts while trying to keep me from suing them. I signed anyway because I just wanted this day to be over. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Janelle asking for my room number and saying she was an hour away. At least I wouldn't be alone tonight. Rosie brought me water and crackers since I hadn't eaten since breakfast. My stomach was too upset to handle real food anyway. She sat with me while I nibbled and sipped, neither of us talking much. We could hear police in the hallway interviewing other staff members. Everyone was trying to figure out how Blake got in and if he'd targeted anyone else. The reality of what almost happened kept hitting me in waves. The cardiac team arrived around 10 with 3 doctors and a specialist who started hooking up more equipment to track my heart. They ran an EKG while I was still lying there, and the specialist watched the printout with a serious look on her face. She explained that my heart was showing signs of something called supraventricular tachycardia, or SVT for short. The condition makes your heart beat way too fast during stress or physical activity. She said the fake doctor situation probably triggered the worst episode I'd ever had. They needed to do more tests over the next few days to figure out the best treatment plan. The specialist gave me a portable heart monitor that looked like a small phone to wear for the next month. I had to press a button every time I felt my heart racing, and it would record everything. She showed me how to upload the data each night so they could track patterns. The next morning, they started talking about discharge, but it wasn't like normal hospital releases I'd heard about. Hugh came back with a whole list of safety stuff they wanted me to follow. No taking ride shares by myself for at least 2 weeks. They put a special flag on my medical records that required extra verification for anyone accessing them. Hugh wrote his personal cell number on a card and told me to call day or night if anything felt wrong. The hospital security team would escort me to my car when I left. They even checked my license plate to make sure nobody had put a tracker on my car while I was inside. Janelle drove me home that afternoon and stayed to help me with everything Hugh had warned me about. We went straight to my laptop and I started freezing all my credit with the 3 main bureaus. My hands were still shaking from everything as I typed in all the security questions. Every single password for every account I had got changed to something completely new. I wrote them all down in a notebook that I'd keep hidden in my bedroom. We changed my bank accounts, my email, my social media, even my Netflix password. Hugh had said these rings sell full identity packages, and they already had my blood, which meant DNA too. 3 days later, I was making lunch when my phone rang with a local number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was from the hospital billing and needed to verify my information. She asked for my social security number to process my insurance claim from the incident. Something felt off about how she was talking. Too pushy and informal for a real billing department. I told her I'd call back through the main hospital number and she got aggressive fast. She said my claim would be denied if I didn't verify right now. That's when I knew it was fake because Catherine had already promised in writing that everything was covered. I hung up and called Hugh immediately to report it. He wasn't surprised at all and said this was exactly their pattern. They used the initial attack to get basic info, then follow up with phone scams for more details. He took down the number that called me and said they'd trace it. He explained that the ring creates detailed identity packages with medical history, financial data, and personal information. These packages sell for thousands on the dark web to people who need new identities. My phone number got added to a special monitored list that would flag suspicious calls automatically. Later that week, Rosie texted me through the official patient portal with something that made me sick. A temporary nurse who'd been working that day saw someone matching Blake's description hanging around the cardiac unit hours before my attack. He'd been watching the rooms and seemed to be listening to conversations about patient conditions. The nurse didn't report it at the time because she thought he was a resident or student. Knowing he'd been hunting for victims, specifically looking for vulnerable patients, made my skin crawl. He'd probably heard about my heart condition and picked me as an easy target. 2 weeks after the attack, Catherine called to ask if she could use my case for mandatory security training. She wanted to show all staff what to look for and how these criminals operate. I agreed, but only if they finally installed the badge scanning system they'd been putting off for years. She promised it would be operational within the month and invited me to see it when ready. The cardiac specialist scheduled another appointment to go over my treatment options in detail. Unlike Blake with his rushed fake emergency, she took over an hour explaining everything clearly. She showed me diagrams of how SVT affects the heart's electrical system. We talked about daily medication to control my heart rate. She mentioned a procedure called catheter ablation that could potentially fix the problem permanently. For now, we'd try medication and see how the monitor data looked over the next few weeks. She made sure I understood every option and felt in control of my own care. Hugh visited my apartment one evening with a laptop to show me something important. He pulled up surveillance footage from the hospital, and I saw Blake clearly for the first time. The green jeans and oversized white coat were obvious in the video. He had dark hair and looked maybe 30 years old, younger than I'd thought during the attack. Seeing his actual face on the screen made everything more real somehow. This wasn't some shadowy figure anymore, but an actual person who'd tried to hurt me. Hugh had me watch how Blake moved through the hospital, avoiding main areas and ducking cameras when possible. About a month after everything happened, a thick envelope arrived certified mail from the hospital's legal department. The formal breach notification listed everything that might have been compromised during the attack. My name, address, birth date, insurance information, and medical history were all potentially in criminal hands. They offered 2 years of identity monitoring service, which seemed like nothing considering what almost happened. The letter was full of legal language basically protecting the hospital from lawsuits. I kept every piece of paper in a folder that was getting thicker by the day. Janelle showed up at my door 2 days later carrying her med school textbooks and a box of my favorite takeout. She dropped everything on my counter and immediately started going through the copy of Blake's fake intake notes that Hugh had given me for my records. Her finger stopped on a line where Blake had written about checking my vitals, and she shook her head hard. "This is wrong. Completely wrong," she said, pointing at where he'd written about proxies instead of proxies and used milliliters for a measurement that should have been in milligrams. She grabbed her phone and called Hugh right away to tell him what she'd found. Hugh listened to her explain how no real medical professional would make these basic mistakes, and how Blake must have had someone feeding him just enough medical terms to sound convincing, but not someone with actual training. He thanked her and said this changed their whole investigation, because now they were looking for an accomplice who worked in healthcare, but wasn't a doctor or nurse. That same night, I was taking out my trash when I noticed the same beat-up sedan parked across from my building that I'd seen the night before. The plates were local, but when I checked my building's visitor log the next morning, no delivery drivers had been scheduled for either night. I took photos of the car with my phone, making sure to get the license plate clearly, and texted them to Hugh. He responded within minutes telling me to stay inside and lock my doors while he ran the plates. The car was gone 20 minutes later when I checked again, but Hugh called to say the plates came back to a rental company, and they were pulling the records. My hands were shaking as I double-checked all my window locks and pulled my blinds closed. 3 days later, I got a text from Rosie through the hospital's secure messaging system, asking if I could meet her for coffee. When I got to the cafe near the hospital, she was already there with her laptop open. She turned the screen toward me to show the new badge scanning system they'd installed on every unit door in the cardiac wing. "It went live yesterday," she said, scrolling through photos of the scanners. "Staff had to badge in and out of every unit now, no exceptions, and the system logged everything with timestamps and photos. Some of the older doctors were complaining about the extra 10 seconds it took to enter units, but most nurses were relieved to have actual security." She showed me an email from Catherine announcing that any manual overrides would require supervisor approval and documentation. The system had already caught 2 people trying to tailgate through doors without badges on the first day. Hugh called that afternoon and asked if he could stop by with some information about Blake. He arrived with a manila folder full of documents and spread them across my kitchen table. There were business records showing Blake had been part owner of a clinical lab that shut down 6 months ago for insurance fraud. Bank records showed he owed over $80,000 to various lenders, including some that Hugh said were known to use violent collection methods. Employment records from 3 different hospitals showed he'd been fired from housekeeping and transport jobs for theft. "He's desperate and in debt, but he's not smart enough to run this whole operation," Hugh explained, showing me phone records with hundreds of calls to burner phones. The pattern was clear that Blake was taking orders from someone else. My insurance company called the next morning about a lab charge for $1,200 that had just been submitted. The woman on the phone read me the details and my stomach dropped when she said it was for genetic testing I'd never had, submitted under the name of a real doctor at the hospital. I told her it was fraud, and she immediately flagged the claim while I grabbed my notebook to write down every detail. She gave me a case number and said their fraud department would investigate. Hugh had warned me this would happen, that they'd try to milk my insurance for everything they could before the companies caught on. I spent the next hour on the phone with the fraud department giving them dates and details while typing everything into a document on my laptop. 2 nights later, I woke up at 2 a.m. with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My monitor showed 180 beats per minute and climbing. I sat up and started the vagal maneuvers the cardiologist had taught me, bearing down like I was trying to lift something heavy. When that didn't work, I filled a bowl with ice water from my freezer and dunked my face in it. The cold shock made my body react and my heart rate started dropping slowly. I grabbed my phone and recorded a video of my monitor showing the whole episode, then wrote down everything in the symptom diary the cardiologist had given me. The episode lasted 43 minutes total, and I documented every technique I tried and what finally worked. Hugh called the next afternoon with an unusual request. The scammers had been calling other victims and he wanted me to answer the next fake call while the police traced it. He came over with a simple script and recording equipment. We didn't have to wait long before my phone rang with another local number I didn't recognize. Hugh nodded and I answered while he started the trace. "This is the billing department calling about your recent hospital visit," the voice said, and I followed Hugh's script perfectly, even though my voice shook. I kept them on the line for 4 minutes talking about verifying my information while Hugh's equipment worked. When they finally hung up, Hugh smiled and said they'd gotten a location ping from a motel 15 miles away. Rosie texted me that night asking if we could talk privately. She came to my apartment after her shift and told me something that made me furious. A float nurse had admitted to letting Blake onto the unit because his white coat looked real, and he'd said he was covering for another doctor. The nurse hadn't asked for ID or verification, just opened the door because it was easier than making him wait for security. She thought she was being helpful, Rosie said, but I could see she was just as angry as me. The hospital was treating it as a training issue instead of the massive security failure it really was. Catherine called the next day and asked if I could come to her office. When I got there, she had security logs spread across her desk and looked exhausted. She showed me a specific entry where someone had used a manual override code to open the cardiac unit door without badging in. "This happens at least once per shift," she admitted, explaining that staff used these codes when they forgot their badges or when the readers malfunctioned. The override codes were supposed to be for emergencies only, but had become a convenience tool that anyone could use if they watched someone enter it. She promised they were changing to individual codes that would track who used them, but the damage was already done. Janelle called that evening with news that made everything click into place. Her study group included someone who'd worked at a medical temp agency 2 years ago, and he recognized Blake's photo immediately. Blake had worked there for 3 months doing basic admin work before being fired for accessing patient records he wasn't authorized to see. Janelle's classmate still had contacts at the agency, and within 2 hours Hugh had a court order for Blake's employee records. The files showed Blake had worked at 6 different medical facilities through the agency, giving him inside knowledge of how hospitals operated and where their security gaps were. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text claiming my lab results were ready to view online. The message looked real with the hospital logo and everything, but when I clicked the link, it went to a site asking for my patient portal login. Something felt off about the URL, so I called the hospital IT department instead of entering my password. The tech guy on the phone got really serious when I described the text and asked me to forward it immediately. He called back 20 minutes later saying the link went to a fake site designed to steal login credentials, and the hosting traced back to shell companies connected to the trafficking ring Hugh was investigating. My heart episodes were getting worse and happening almost every day now. I'd wake up at night with my chest pounding and have to do the ice water trick just to get my heart rate down. The cardiologist looked at my symptom diary during my follow-up and said the episodes were too frequent to manage with just medication. She recommended ablation surgery within the month to burn the problem areas in my heart that were causing the rapid beats. I scheduled it for 3 weeks out and tried not to think about how Blake's attack had made everything worse. Hugh called that afternoon asking if I could come to the station for a voice lineup. He had me sit in a quiet room with headphones while 6 different voice recordings played, saying the same phrase. When recording number 4 started and I heard those words, "Keep quiet and shut up," my whole body tensed up. It was Blake's voice without any doubt, and I told Hugh immediately, even though hearing it made me feel sick. He said my identification was solid evidence and would help with the prosecution. 2 nights later, my neighbor knocked on my door holding his phone. He showed me doorbell camera footage from that afternoon of someone checking my mailbox while I was at work. The person wore a baseball cap pulled low, but you could see their shoes clearly in the video. They were the same white sneakers with the blue stripe that Blake wore in the hospital security footage. My neighbor had already saved the video and said he'd give it to the police. Having someone violate my home space felt different from the hospital attack, because this was supposed to be my safe place. I went to the post office the next morning and got a P.O. box, then spent an hour changing my mailing address for everything important. I started taking different routes to work and the grocery store, never following the same pattern twice. The only people who knew my real schedule were Hugh, Janelle, and Rosie, since I needed someone to know where I was in case something happened. Taking these steps helped me feel less helpless than I did lying on that examination table with Blake digging in my arm. Catherine called me into her office later that week and introduced me to a woman named Sarah who would be my victim liaison. Sarah's job was to fight all the fraudulent insurance claims, so I could focus on getting better instead of drowning in paperwork. She already had a thick folder of rejected claims and showed me how the scammers had tried billing for procedures I never had using real doctor names to make it look legitimate. Having someone else handle this mess took a huge weight off my shoulders. Hugh had big news when he called the next day. They'd flipped someone from the temp agency who worked with Blake, a guy who needed money for his kids' medical bills and got pulled into the scheme. This guy gave them Blake's handler's name and identified a storage unit where they dropped off stolen blood samples. The investigation was finally moving toward real arrests instead of just gathering evidence. Hugh said they were building cases against 12 people total, and my case was one of the strongest because of all the documentation I'd kept. The hospital suggested I attend their crime victim support group, and I went to my first meeting that Thursday evening. There were 8 other people there, all dealing with different crimes but understanding exactly how it felt to have your safety violated. One woman talked about checking her locks 5 times before bed after a break-in, and I realized I'd been doing the same thing since Blake's attack. The counselor leading the group gave us practical tips for managing anxiety and paranoia that actually helped more than I expected. Hearing other people's stories made me realize I wasn't going crazy or overreacting to what happened. Hugh needed my consent to include all the phishing texts and warrant applications for the bigger trafficking ring. I forwarded everything from my phone immediately and signed the consent forms he brought over. He explained they were going after the whole network now, not just Blake, and every piece of evidence would help shut them down. I wanted them to use anything that would stop these people from hurting anyone else. Rosie texted me about a staff meeting that got pretty heated when they discussed the new badge policies. She said some doctors were complaining about the inconvenience of having to badge in at every door and remember their individual codes. But most of the nurses and techs were relieved that patient safety was finally being taken seriously after what happened to me. The new system would track exactly who entered each unit and when, making it impossible for someone like Blake to slip through again. Janelle came over the next afternoon with a stack of index cards and started drilling me on possible deposition questions. She'd written down every uncomfortable thing the defense might ask about my medical history and personal life. We sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours while she fired questions at me in different tones, sometimes aggressive, sometimes sympathetic. My heart monitor kept beeping whenever certain questions made me anxious, but after the 20th practice round, I could answer calmly about the attack without my pulse spiking past 100. She taught me to pause before answering, take a sip of water if I needed time to think, and keep my answers short and factual. The practice helped more than I expected, because when the real questions came, I'd already heard worse versions from my sister. Hugh called 2 days later with news that made me sit down hard on my couch. The warrant on the shell company's servers had come through, and the IT forensics team found spreadsheets with thousands of names. Hospital admission records from 6 different facilities matched up perfectly with their donor compatibility lists. They'd been doing this for at least 18 months, systematically targeting vulnerable patients who came in alone or seemed confused. The scale of it made me feel cold and angry instead of scared like before. These weren't desperate criminals making impulsive choices, but an organized operation treating sick people like inventory. Hugh asked if I could help with something that made my stomach flip. They needed me to stay in public places for the next 48 hours and share my location with them constantly. The surveillance team thought someone might try to contact me or follow me to find out what I knew. I agreed, even though it felt like painting a target on my back. I spent those 2 days at the mall, the library, coffee shops, anywhere with cameras and witnesses. My phone stayed on with location sharing active, and I texted Hugh every time I moved to a new spot. Nothing happened the first day, but I kept checking behind me and watching reflections in windows. The second afternoon, Hugh texted me to act normal, but be ready because something was happening. I sat in the food court pretending to read while my heart pounded. 20 minutes later, Hugh called to say they'd followed a courier from the blood sample drop site to a motel on the edge of town. The surveillance team watched the courier knock on room 217, and Blake himself opened the door to take a package. Hugh said they were moving in within the hour, and I should stay where I was until he called back. I bought another coffee with shaking hands and waited. My phone rang exactly 53 minutes later. Hugh's voice sounded relieved when he told me Blake tried to run when the police surrounded the motel. He'd bolted out the back door but slipped on the wet pavement in the parking lot and went down hard. They arrested him without anyone getting hurt, and he was already in custody. I felt my shoulders drop and realized I'd been holding them tight for days. The tension release made me dizzy, and I had to sit back down. Hugh said they were processing the motel room and would have more information soon. The next morning, Hugh called with an update that made everything feel more real. They'd recovered 12 blood vials from a mini fridge in Blake's room, along with detailed ledgers showing payment records. The chain of custody was perfect, and the physical evidence would make prosecution almost certain. Hugh warned me the legal process would take months or maybe a year, but they had him solid. I went to the police station that afternoon to give my formal recorded statement with Janelle sitting beside me for support. The detective explained everything about bail hearings and how long trials really take, so I wouldn't expect quick resolution. She said Blake would probably get bail, but with strict conditions, and the prosecutor would push for the maximum restrictions. The whole process took 4 hours and left me exhausted. Catherine's letter arrived by certified mail 3 days later. The hospital's legal team had drafted a formal apology accepting complete responsibility for the security failures that let Blake access patient areas. They extended my identity monitoring from 2 years to 5 and included coverage for all counseling costs related to the incident. The letter felt like real accountability instead of just legal protection. Reading it made me feel like the hospital actually understood how badly they'd failed. My pre-op appointments for the ablation started the following week. The cardiac team went through every detail of the procedure, explaining risks and benefits while I signed consent forms. Each step was transparent, with multiple chances to ask questions and change my mind. The difference from Blake's fake emergency approach was so stark, it actually helped restore some trust in medical care. They scheduled the procedure for 2 weeks out and gave me detailed prep instructions. Blake's bail hearing happened faster than expected. Hugh attended and texted me updates from the courtroom. The judge set bail at $200,000 with conditions including ankle monitoring and zero contact with any medical facilities. Blake's public defender mentioned possible cooperation with prosecutors about the larger trafficking ring. Hugh said that usually meant they had bigger fish to catch, and Blake might flip for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor seemed interested, which could mean faster resolution of the whole case. That possibility made me feel hopeful for the first time since the attack. The morning of my ablation came 2 weeks later, and I checked in at 5:30 while it was still dark outside. The prep nurse shaved small patches on my chest for the electrode pads and started an IV in my left hand, while explaining they'd go through my groin arteries to reach my heart. The anesthesiologist came by to review my allergies and said I'd be under light sedation, but might remember parts of the procedure. They wheeled me into the cath lab where machines beeped and monitors showed my heart rhythm jumping around at 140, even though I was lying still. The doctor made 2 small cuts in my groin, and I felt pressure as she threaded the catheters up through my blood vessels. The mapping took forever as they triggered my SVT on purpose to find the bad electrical pathway, and I remember feeling my heart racing while they worked. When they found the problem spot, they burned it with radio waves, and I felt this weird warm sensation in my chest that wasn't exactly painful, but definitely strange. I woke up in recovery 4 hours later with Janelle holding my hand and the monitor showing a steady 70 beats per minute for the first time in months. The pressure bandages on my groin meant I had to lie flat for 6 hours, but I didn't care because my heart felt calm and steady instead of like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. Janelle stayed overnight in the uncomfortable visitor chair and helped me to the bathroom when they finally let me stand up the next morning. Rosie stopped by during her lunch break the day after I got home and brought homemade soup in a mason jar. She sat on my couch and told me how security had caught 3 people with fake badges just this week using the new scanning system. The staff meeting last month had everyone on high alert, and nurses were calling security for any visitor who seemed off or couldn't explain why they were there. She said one guy claimed to be from medical records, but ran when they asked to verify his employee number. The culture shift was real and happening because of what I went through. Hugh called that evening with news that made me sit up despite the soreness in my groin. Blake had given up 12 names, including 2 hospital employees who'd been feeding him patient information and admission schedules. The FBI raided 6 locations that morning and arrested 3 more people, including the woman who ran the shell company that processed the stolen samples. Blake showed them the warehouse where they kept compatibility lists and medical records for over 3,000 potential victims across 4 states. The whole operation was falling apart because Blake wanted a deal more than he wanted to protect his partners. My insurance company called the next day, and the woman on the phone actually apologized for what I'd been through. She confirmed they'd reversed all 7 fraudulent charges totaling almost $40,000 and cleared the flags on my account. The documentation I'd sent with Hugh's case number had made their investigation simple, and they were pursuing criminal charges against the people who'd submitted the false claims. She emailed me written confirmation that my credit score wouldn't be affected, and my account was completely clear. My 2-week follow-up with the cardiac specialist went perfectly, with my heart staying between 60 and 80 the whole visit. She downloaded the data from my monitor and showed me the graphs where my rate stayed normal even during exercise and stress. The ablation had worked, and she cleared me to start walking again with a gradual build-up to jogging over the next month. She printed out a specific schedule that started with 10-minute walks and slowly increased the time and intensity. I stuck the paper on my fridge and checked off each workout as I completed it. Catherine's email came 3 weeks later asking if I'd speak at the mandatory security training they were rolling out to all staff. She wanted patients to hear directly from someone who'd been targeted so they'd understand why the new badge rules mattered. I agreed, but told her I wouldn't discuss my medical details or answer questions about the ongoing legal case. We scheduled it for the following month, and she promised to keep it to 20 minutes with security present. The court documents arrived by certified mail 6 weeks after Blake's arrest. The prosecutor's office had seized almost $2 million in assets from the trafficking ring, and the judge ordered restitution for victims' expenses. I could claim cash payment for my troubles or have them cover ongoing counseling costs, and I chose the therapy option immediately. Using their dirty money to pay for healing felt like the right kind of justice. 10 weeks after the attack, I laced up my running shoes for the first time and stepped out into the cool morning air. My heart monitor showed 68 as I started with an easy walk around the block, then picked up to a light jog on the second lap. The rhythm felt smooth and steady without that fluttering sensation that used to make me stop and grab my chest. I ran for 12 minutes total, and my heart peaked at 120, then dropped back to normal within 2 minutes of walking. Hugh's business card stayed saved in my phone, and I'd probably keep it there forever as a reminder that good cops exist. My life felt normal again, but with new awareness of how quick things could go wrong and how important it was to trust your instincts when something felt off. Thanks for hanging out and wondering through all of this with me. Definitely felt like a real journey together. Until we meet again, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.